Liu He, and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak. I am Alexander Shin, and today in Taiwan we speak Taigi, a language of many names. Some people call it Taiwanese, some people call it Taigi, Taiwanese Hokkien, or Taiwanese Minnan. I am joined today by Kí Phín-tsì, a freelance linguist and Taigi translator, also co-creator of the Bite-Size Taiwanese podcast. Hi, Phín-tsì.
Hi, Oleg. Great.
Thank you for coming here today.
My pleasure.
So usually before we start, I ask my guests to read something for us, for our audience in their language. Would you like to have a go?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna read a poem written by Dan Lui. He's a Taiwanese writer and physician who lives in Ontario, Canada. And the title of this poem is 永遠的故鄉, which means Forever My Homeland. 永遠的故鄉，看到是茫茫的海水，思念是遠遠的故鄉。30年陪鳥咧流浪，故鄉。我的故鄉，闻到是香香的花味，風吹是靜靜的故鄉，一兩叢蓮霧在開花，故鄉，我的故鄉，照到是白白的月光，出日是美麗的故鄉，三四架稻仔在結穗，故鄉，我的故鄉，聽到是近近的笑聲。做夢是細漢的故鄉，五六隻田嬰咧耍水，故鄉，我的故鄉。踏到是青青的土地，希望是永遠的故鄉。每一遍心內在叫你，故鄉，永遠的故鄉。So that was it.
Not even understanding Taigi, I can already guess that it's about motherland, right? Because
Yeah, that's correct.
고향 reminds me of the Korean word 고향, which is probably a cognate.
Mm-hmm. So it means homeland as well, right? In Korean?
Right.
Okay.
Is it about Taiwan, the homeland?
Yeah, so this author, Dan Lui, left Taiwan when he was in his 20s, and I think he's 85 this year. So although he has lived much of his life abroad, a lot of his work, just like this poem, expresses his deep affection for his homeland, Taiwan. And he's most famous for his short stories and novels, but this particular poem is also pretty well known. You can actually find a lot of videos online of different choirs singing this piece because there was a famous Taiwanese composer, Taigi, who set it to choral music. And also there's this other singer and writer, Ming-tiet, who turned this poem into a folk style song.
Is it well known in Taiwan?
Yeah, I think, because I used to sing in choirs as well, so I think a lot of choirs have sung this piece.
So now that you're mentioning that, I think it's only right if you also sing it for us.
Nah, I'm gonna just skip it for now. Yeah, but I can talk a little bit about the poem itself. It's a beautiful poem of someone missing his homeland. Its scenery and its landscape, the smell of the flowers, the childhood memories, and so on. And this poem expresses a rich image with very simple and sincere language. I actually prepared the English translation of this whole poem. It's translated by Winston Oh, who is a second-generation Taiwanese American. Forever my homeland. What I see is the misty ocean. What I yearn for is my distant homeland. 30 years the drifting birds wander. Homeland, my homeland. What I smell is the fragrant flowers. What wafts on the wind is my peaceful homeland. 1 or 2 lembu trees bloom. Homeland, my homeland. What I bask in is the silver moonlight. What dawn reveals is my beautiful homeland. 3 or 4 acres of rice ripen. Homeland, my homeland. What I hear is the sound of nearby laughter. What I dream of is my childhood homeland. 5 or 6 marsh dragonflies frolic. Homeland, my homeland. What I step on is the verdant earth. What I hope for is my eternal homeland. Each time in my heart it is you that I call. Homeland, forever my homeland.
It's a poem that incites visual imagination because I could just picture those fields of Taiwan as you were reading.
Yeah, that's what I like about this poem as well, because it really expresses a lot of feelings, emotions, images with very, very simple language. It can also be nostalgic or even heartbreaking poem if you know a little bit more about the background. So in the first part, 30年回教的流浪, 30 years, the drifting birds wander. This line likely refers to the author's life as an overseas Taiwanese. And the timing, it was written around the early 90s when martial law has just been lifted in Taiwan. However, many political dissidents were still blacklisted by the KMT, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, and were unable to return to Taiwan. So therefore, this piece resonates with many overseas Taiwanese, as well as many who were banned from returning home for decades because of the political situation.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that poem here today. I think especially our listeners who are also in a situation that is similar, who are in exile, not being able to be in their homeland, might feel the emotion that the author put in it, and as well as personal tragedy to some extent.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about you. You're a freelance translator, and you mentioned that you're currently working on translating some of the world classics into Taigi. I can only assume that it's not one of those languages that you often translate literature into. What are some of the works that you're working on?
It's a project led by Professor Dan Lei-kun, who is from the Department of Taiwanese Literature at National Cheng Kung University. So far, they have published Grimm's Fairy Tales from Germany, Anne of Green Gables from Canada, La Fontaine's Fables from France, Night on the Galactic Railroad from Japan. So I've recently been invited to co-translate some Sherlock Holmes stories into Taiwanese, which is going to be their next publication in this series. The book series project we just talked about is introducing world classics through Taigi translation to Taiwanese readers. Whereas the other project I'm working on with a small team is creating a textbook to introduce Taiwanese to the world. This textbook will contain a collection of short Taiwanese texts with English translation. So you can also think of it as kind of a parallel reader for students, and there will also be some notes and exercises as well.
Recently, you gifted me a very interesting book. It's called Vocabulary Builder, Short Takes. Yes, and it's authored by you. And the book that you're working on right now, is it going to be building on vocabulary that's already included in your first book?
Yeah, I think the level of this next book will be slightly higher because we actually got a lot of feedback from foreign students and also from heritage speakers like second generation Taiwanese American, and they are saying that your textbook, like short takes or your podcasts, are not difficult enough. So they want something more than just saying hello or very basic words. I think for this next book, we are building on that and the level more suitable for intermediate students.
Now, going back to what you mentioned earlier, that you're also translating world classics into Taiwanese. How do you say Sherlock Holmes in Taiwanese, first of all?
That's a good question. I think in the end, we sort of reach an agreement to call him Sherlock Holmes.
Sounds very close.
Yeah.
I think one of the advantages of Taiwanese phonetics as compared to Mandarin is that the final consonants, they're more diverse, right, than Mandarin. So like Sherlock, that lock, you wouldn't be able to say in Mandarin.
Yeah, I think in Mandarin translations, they usually call him 夏洛克福尔摩斯. So that's a lot of syllables there.
All right. That's interesting. Now, as a translator, What are some of the major challenges when you do translation from English to Taiyi?
I would say most of the challenges are just very similar to the translation work of other languages. But I think maybe what is slightly different is that Taiwanese is a spoken language with a lot of variations, and it is standardized to a lesser degree in terms of writing, at least at the community level. Most Taiwanese speakers are not fluent in reading Taiwanese texts, so quite often the first consideration is which writing system to use. I think depending on the target audience, it might be either in Bite-Size or Taigi using the Roman scripts, or Hanji, which are Chinese characters adapted for writing Taiwanese, and sometimes both or a mix of them. So I think that's the tricky bit whenever we want to translate something into Taiwanese. I would say it's something that is very different from other major languages. Another thing is that the writers or translators might also need to add a lot of footnotes or even translations in Mandarin. And also the publishers would often consider providing audio recordings to help the readers.
Because not all people can read Taiwanese.
Yeah, so even if we try to have a very good translation of Sherlock Holmes stories, usually the publishers would want to have, something like an audio book to come with the publication. And also editors or designers, they might encounter technical issues, especially if they have little experience dealing with Taiwanese text, mainly because of the scripts, tone marks, and everything. So not every font or software supports Taiwanese. When I work on Taiwanese language project, it often involves educating the clients and also the users. So I would say the most challenging thing is not directly related to translation itself, but the market at large. So for example, I have some friends who would just write in full Bite-Size or Taigi romanization scripts, and some other friends who write mostly in the Chinese characters suggested by the Ministry of Education. So when I write to them, I might use more Chinese characters. So it really depends on the background of the audience, because not everyone is familiar with the standardized writing system that is suggested by the Ministry of Education. I think it's really hard to write in Taiwanese using only common Chinese characters. And the reason is that there are many Taiwanese words that are not of Chinese origin or do not have a general consensus as to how they should be written. Yeah, so even though the Ministry of Education has tried to further standardize the language and suggested a set of special characters to write Taiwanese using Chinese characters, it is still very difficult for many people and it takes a lot of time to learn. So if you follow this standard, sometimes you would need to use a very rare or invented character that hardly anyone could read. And sometimes people would just find whatever character that sounds similar to sort of spell the word out. Most people in Taiwan now are literate in Chinese Mandarin. So whenever they are easily readable, they would use Chinese characters. And whenever there are, complicated cases, you can just use the Roman scripts. So that way you have a bit of freedom. And I guess it's somewhat like in Japanese, they would use kanji to write certain words, usually, of Chinese origin. And then they would use kana to spell other words. So I see a lot of people using this, we call it Hanle or the Han mix. So Hanji, like Chinese characters, and Romaji, Roman scripts.
Mixed together. For those of our listeners who've already checked out our first series on Taigi with Professor Lim Kai, would know that Taiwanese is facing this problem of not having a standardized writing system. And I think this is a very good introduction into how that problem is translating into a translator's job and the challenges that this profession brings, specifically in the case of Taigi. Thank you, Phín-tsì, for that very interesting insight. And with that, we're gonna end our episode here. As always, there's gonna be part 2 coming up next. Dear listeners, please do come back, and thank you for listening. My name is Oleg, and this was In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. See you next week.